When I was in high school, I loved photography a lot. I always dreamed that someday an important media would hire me as a photojournalist. It was one of those things that I was passionate about, and basically I was dedicated to photographing anything that was put in front of me. That's how one night, I decided to venture to an old psychiatric ward that was abandoned near my house, as it seemed to me that this place was perfect for some night photos. It was something I had been thinking about for several weeks, when I saw an excellent documentary about an abandoned, supposedly haunted hospital in Kansas, and was fascinated with the photographic work that was featured in the documentary. I figured that if I wanted to do this professionally, that was the kind of quality I wanted for my work. So that night I made up my mind and got to work. The place had been closed for quite a while, about 14 or 15 years, so I talked to a friend who had been there before, and he was very enthusiastic about joining me. So that night we met at his house, and from there we drove to the site. I understood that the old asylum was to be demolished in a month, so I wanted to capture the best memories of a building that had had so many stories before it became ruins. That place was also said to be haunted, but it's rare that that's not said about any abandoned building, especially if it's a psychiatric facility. Besides, neither my friend nor I were the type to believe in ghosts. When we arrived, we left the car far away in a house a few blocks away so that the police wouldn't catch us during their nightly rounds. My friend, who was the one who already knew the building, took the lead, and I followed him excitedly, but also somewhat nervously, I won't deny it. As we made our way down the road towards the building, the atmosphere was definitely eerie. It was like a huge shadow in the middle of the night, and it was just the two of us there. Once we reached a point of no return, we hopped the fence and walked across the lawn to the side door of the old emergency, which they said was open. Honestly, I wasn't expecting anything strange to happen. However, as soon as the creaky door opened, I was hit with a damp, musty air, something that smelled horrible, like urine mixed with bleach, a really strong and unpleasant aroma. It even felt like it stung my nose. We turned on our flashlights and started walking down the long, dark hallway. The place was not in its best condition. There were holes everywhere and wires hanging from the ceiling. I took some pictures of the second floor, and we explored a couple of rooms, which looked like they were frozen in time. The beds were still made up, and there were things in the closet. I even found old drawings that I assumed were from some of the patients that had stayed in those rooms. Although the place was really creepy, that didn't stop us for a moment, and we were enjoying the moment. We even found the old elevator, which was trashed inside, but it was ideal for some pictures, so I didn't waste time and started taking captures. Then we discovered a staircase leading down to the basement. Although we had our doubts about going down there or not, in the end we decided to do it. I didn't feel scared on the second floor, but the basement had a very strange vibe, and, well, it was a basement, and basements are always creepy, even more so that of an abandoned and completely dark psychiatric hospital. When we went down, our flashlights barely illuminated a few feet ahead. As expected, this place was much darker than the rest of the building. I even had my doubts about whether it would be worth taking pictures there. I just hoped that my camera's flash and resolution would be powerful enough to capture good shots in the middle of that thick gloom. As we were walking along, we came upon a door that said boiler room. I tried to open it, but it was stuck. However, after some effort, I managed to get it to open a little, just enough for us to get inside. Inside were some old machines I had never seen before and several boxes of what appeared to be electrical equipment, but everything was in a sorry state. After taking a few pictures, we headed to another room labeled storage, where there were old hospital beds with leather straps hanging down the sides. It was just what I had imagined. Some of the straps had teeth marks on them, and the carts were so scuffed and broken that I couldn't help but wonder what had happened here. The scene was quite eerie and perfect for some good photos, but just as I was setting up the shot, a loud boom echoed through the basement. We froze, trying to hear where the noise was coming from. But with the empty hallways echoing the sound, it was hard to figure out. My friend immediately came out of the room and with his flashlight in hand shouted "Hello, is anyone there?" My body filled with tension as we waited for a response, but it didn't come. However, we began to hear a faint sound. It was like heavy breathing mixed with some sort of grunting. My friend and I looked at each other, and at that moment the real uneasiness began to sink deep inside me. He told me he would go a little further down the hall to see if I could figure out where the sound was coming from, but I followed him into the hallway and told him that I didn't think it was a good idea and that it would be best if we left. He agreed, as what we were experiencing was too weird and it didn't seem like we were alone, so we headed back the way we came in. We were walking towards the stairs when suddenly, we heard another noise. This time, it sounded like a bunch of tools had fallen to the floor. We quickly looked at each other, pointing our flashlights into the darkness of the hallway, but it was as if our lights were useless. At that instant, I heard footsteps on the other side of the building, and unless I was hallucinating, they were approaching us very fast. At that moment, panic completely overtook us, and without a second thought, we ran full speed down the stairs to the second floor, and as we reached the end of the hallway to exit, we heard a huge bang right below us. I don't know how to describe it, but it sounded like someone emitting a growl of frustration and then kicking a bunch of objects. That was the image that built in my mind upon hearing that noise, and frankly, I'm almost 100% sure that's just what happened. There was someone or something down there, and it was not at all happy with our presence. So my friend and I started running like demons were after us and didn't stop until we were a significant distance from the building. We finally got back to the car, our hearts racing and our minds blank, exhausted and panting from exhaustion. But we didn't stop. We jumped in the car and immediately took off burning tires. I don't know who we had run into that night, but I was thankful I hadn't found out. When we got home, I was relieved, but everything changed in the morning. I was about to leave when I walked past my father, who was watching the news, and suddenly, I stopped dead in my tracks. The headline they announced was that the old mental institution had burned down the night before, shortly after we left. Clearly, I didn't want to tell my dad that I had been there, so I left the house and headed to school in total disbelief. Despite getting some amazing pictures that night, it still unsettles me to think that someone could have been there with us and we didn't even notice. Maybe it was a crazy coincidence, but deep down I knew that couldn't be it. There was an old forgotten cat shelter on the outskirts of my town. Legend had it that they let a stray cat in and it had some strange flesh-eating disease that they failed to detect in time, so the cat ended up mixing with all the others and infecting them. In the end, all the cats died, and in view of this huge neglect, the shelter ran out of donations and closed its doors. Some said that there were still piles of cat carcasses inside the building because they never cleaned the place before closing it. Sure, that story was such a monumental exaggeration that no one with a lick of sense would believe it, but it became an urban legend and lent a creepy character to the abandoned building. I heard these rumors for a long time, and some people even claimed that if you went in there at night, you could hear creepy meows of ghost cats. Of course, I didn't believe this hearsay either, but I had always been curious to see what the shelter was really like inside and wanted to go in and investigate. I knew that far from the fanciful stories people told about this place, the tour would most likely be somewhat boring, but I wasn't going to find out without checking it out. Finally, one night, I plucked up the courage and decided to go in. I waited until midnight because I didn't want anyone to see me. It certainly felt strange to approach the dark building at that hour, but I was carrying a flashlight. However, I wasn't so sure if there was an access way I could use. A monumental oversight on my part not to have foreseen that. Fortunately, after some searching, I found a broken window in the back that was big enough for me to get in. All I had to do was climb a bit, and so I did, and in a matter of seconds I was inside. I didn't want to hurt the place, so upon entering I started exploring the different rooms, and as I had guessed, the shelter wasn't all that exciting in real life. There was a lot of old furniture, shelves and stuff, but I didn't see any bodies of cats lying around or anything that would explain why the place had closed. It was really just a regular old dilapidated building. I continued exploring the place, and as I entered one of the rooms that looked like some sort of veterinarian's office, obviously, I heard a noise coming from the hallway. I immediately turned and looked in that direction. Then it seemed to me that the sound was coming from a room that was once a large cat playroom. There was a giant cat tree, and it was enclosed by a screen, which made me curious if maybe there was a cat or some other animal in there, taking advantage of that space to play, so I decided to take a look. I entered through the protected area and pointed my flashlight everywhere. At first I didn't see anything, but then I noticed something moving under the cat tree. So without thinking, I focused the light of my flashlight directly on that spot and immediately saw what looked like a blanket on the ground, but there was something moving underneath. I immediately assumed that it was some animal or several animals under the blanket, so I moved a little closer, feeling confident, since whatever was there was in the middle of the play area, under the tree, and separated us by the Maya. I stood watching, trying to figure out what was going on, while still watching the blanket move. It was then that I noticed that it was moving in a strange way, but in the dark I couldn't make it out clearly. Suddenly, I saw human eyes peering out. That person, seeing the light, lowered the blanket and looked at me with a furious expression. "Get away from my kittens," he shouted at me. "Leave my kittens alone." Then he got up, threw the blanket to the side and ran into the mesh, which caused me to recoil, stumble, and fall backwards, completely in shock. The guy was pressed up against the mesh, his face almost pressed against it. You could tell how upset he was. His mouth twisted as he repeated like crazy, "Leave my kittens alone, leave my kittens alone." And at that moment I noticed he was holding what appeared to be the body of an animal in his hands. I assumed it was a cat, because he was holding it in one hand, and with the other he was desperately stroking it. It might have been something else, maybe a grimy stuffed animal, but I didn't feel like finding out what exactly it was. It didn't look like it wanted to break the screen, but I didn't want to take the risk of sticking around to find out. So I bolted out of there, ran straight for the window I'd come in through, and jumped out. As I slipped through the opening, I heard the guy yelling at me to leave his kittens alone. It was weird. Even as I slipped out, I could hear him screaming and sobbing behind me. I got away from that place as fast as I could. While it wasn't a life-changing experience for me, it was pretty scary. The guy was clearly in a bad place emotionally, and that was the most disturbing. I consoled myself with the thought that the shelter was just an abandoned place, and that the guy was probably just a homeless man who had been swallowed up by the place. My friends and I live in an ideal neighborhood, the typical quiet suburb you imagine, where everything seems completely peaceful and boring. Here the peace and quiet is almost palpable, an environment where you don't expect anything dangerous to happen. And it usually does, until you hear what I'm about to tell you. This happened one summer 7 years ago, and try as I might, I can't get that memory out of my head. My friend Leo and I were always looking to get into trouble. We were those kids who got into mischief wherever we went. And looking back, I find it hard to understand why we were like that. Maybe it was that youthful rebelliousness, something like that. Leo and I lived next door to each other. We hung out after school, and since our neighborhood had only big houses and towering trees, we didn't have much to do, so we created our own fun. At the top of a hill that was at the end of my street, there was a mansion that had been abandoned for a long time. Nobody really knew how long, but for as long as I could remember, that mansion was uninhabited. It was no big deal either. It was no big mystery, in fact. All the neighborhood kids had already been inside. Every room had been ransacked, and finding a wall without graffiti was next to impossible. And to top it off, it was right next to a huge cemetery, which gave it a rather weird atmosphere. For Leo and I, that mansion was a refuge. If we had nothing to do, we'd go there to leave our stamp or just hang out on the roof. That particular night, it was around 3 a.m. on a Thursday, and we'd been ditched by a couple of girls we'd planned to hang out with that night. We were both a little disappointed, so we decided that throwing rocks at the mansion would be a good way to release the frustration. If we had been more sober, we would have had more sense, but it was summer and we were a little overdrunk, so it clearly wasn't the time for good ideas. In fact, the only sensible thing I did that night was to convince Leo not to drive, so we walked. After about 20 minutes of walking, we reached the hill, and there it was, a familiar sight, but a little creepy in the dark of night. It had been a while since we had last been here, and now vines covered the bricks. The windows were shattered, and there was a sort of gloomy air that made everything feel very strange at that hour. Suddenly, Leo picked up a stone and threw it toward the house, and we heard a crash as the glass of a third-story window shattered. That combination of moonlight and the echo of the wind bouncing through the empty rooms of the mansion made everything feel even creepier. At that moment, I also picked up a rock and, after a couple of attempts, managed to break a window on the second floor. Further up, there was a small window, probably from an attic, standing alone in the highest part of the mansion. Leo dared me to break it, but after several failed attempts, I decided to give up. However, he smiled, picked up a stone and said, "Watch this." He focused on the small target and threw the rock, watching it fly and break that window with a thunderous noise that made us smile. We were so impressed that we stood for a moment admiring the scene. Leo was about to pick up another rock when suddenly something dark flew out of that broken window and landed in front of us. I literally jumped in shock, confused by what I had seen. We looked down, and there it was, the same rock Leo had thrown, easily recognizable because it had a strange mark on one side. We stood there in shock, a little dazed. It was too late for other kids to be doing the same thing we were doing, so the only explanation we could come up with was that it was a group of teenagers trying to scare us, which ignited a spark of excitement. Our mischievous smiles said it all. We were ready to teach them a lesson. If they wanted to scare us, it would backfire, so we started moving toward the front door, ducking down so as not to hit a thick vine hanging from the pillars at the entrance. The door was a little crooked. It had always been that way. Its hinges were out of adjustment and so it wouldn't close properly. As stealthily as possible, we entered the building and our pupils began to adjust to what little light there was. The smell of mold and rotting wood hit us immediately, which made us wrinkle our noses. Carefully, we began to climb the stairs, which creaked every time we set foot on them. Finally, we reached the 4th floor and stood at the bottom of the last staircase. Oddly, we had never been in this part of the house before, as the entrance to the roof was on the other side, and it seems that this room had eluded us in our previous explorations. Leo took the lead, and I followed close behind as we approached a small wooden door that looked like the access to a loft. Leo grabbed the knob, shooting me a glance. I nodded, and with a nimble movement, he yanked the door open. Immediately upon opening it, I was hit by a smell so strong that I took an involuntary step back. It was nauseating, a stench of death and decay that made me recoil. Leo held his nose, cursing at the rottenness, but went in anyway, while I hesitated for a moment whether to follow him or not. I finally decided that I would rather go with him than stand alone in that dark stairwell. However, the interior was even worse than the smell. We found ourselves in a tiny room with a pentagram painted on the floor in white. It appeared to be painted with whitewash. There were some unlit candles on a closet door that we didn't open, and the scent seemed to be coming from there. I was worried that Leo wanted to investigate because I had no desire to stay in that place. This was strange and creepy, and I didn't think it was a good idea. I immediately told Leo that we should leave, but just as I thought, he wanted to check the place out, thinking that whoever had thrown the rock back at us must be out there somewhere. But to our surprise, the room was empty. I'd had enough of that. I was really starting to get scared, and told Leo I'd leave right away with or without him, but as I turned toward the door, I thought I saw something. Then I looked down the stairs and saw a couple of hooded figures watching us. At that point, I let out a curse and ran towards Leo, but then we heard some loud stomping approaching the door behind us, and panic consumed us. I was really terrified, but I knew we couldn't get caught, so I was ready to face whatever it was, preparing to fight. At that instant, Leo yelled, "Come on, buddy." Then I turned and saw my friend halfway to the broken window, probably trying to get out onto the roof. I did the same, and the moment I managed to reach the top, I heard the door burst open. We ran out onto the roof. We knew we didn't want to stand there and find out if we were being followed. If the situation hadn't been so scary, I'm not sure if I would have continued with our plan, because the darkness made every step a risk. We could fall flat on our faces and break our bones in the fall, so I left, sticking to Leo very carefully, as we reached a roof entrance where there was a hatch leading to a ladder. My friend tried to open it, but it was locked from the inside, and that's when we heard a booming voice from somewhere, sounding like it was shouting in our direction. To this day, it gives me chills to remember that deep voice. At that moment, I panicked and decided I couldn't stand there any longer. I kicked the hatch with all my strength, and to my surprise, it broke with a bang that surely revealed our location to anyone in the house, especially those who were chasing us. The force of the impact sent me tumbling into the hole, and if it hadn't been for my hands grabbing the ladder out of pure reflex, I would have been badly hurt. Leo yelled at me to hurry, so I went down as fast as I could, trying to ignore the pain in my leg. We both ran down another staircase and out the back door, jumping over the fence and running into the cemetery. Leo seemed fine, he was even laughing, while I was so scared I could barely think. I never imagined that crouching behind a headstone in a cemetery could feel so safe. We stood alert for a while, watching the mansion intently, hoping we weren't being followed. We waited a moment, and just when we thought all was quiet, we saw a group of 4 or 5 hooded figures circling the property, frantically searching through the bushes and trees. We stealthily hid in the cemetery until we were sure they couldn't see us in the dark, then jumped the back fence and haven't been back to that house since. I can only assume we stumbled upon some sort of cult gathering. I'm still wondering why they decided to do it in such an abandoned place. The other thing that puzzles me is what would be in that closet that was so rotten. Would it be a dead animal that they had sacrificed in some creepy ritual, or rather, someone? I guess we'll never know for sure, but we haven't been back there since. This happened recently. It all started a year ago at a time when I wasn't really sure what to do with my life. I had just finished college, and instead of looking for a job, I decided to go out and explore the world to find myself. It's a story you hear often. A recent graduate with a degree in hand, but no idea what to do with his life. So one fine day, I grabbed an old car I bought from an online auction site and set out on a year-long road trip adventure, driving around the country and stopping in small towns all over the place. It was really rewarding. I met a lot of amazing people and participated in some of the weirdest festivals, pie contests, folk dancing, and all the village festival activities you can imagine. I also tried all kinds of foods, many of which would have made most people in the US burst into tears. It's so crazy because while we are all part of the same nation, each place has its own personality and culture. I really loved visiting these places, although sometimes I had to stop in some town and do temporary jobs because my money was not enough to survive even a month in this crazy journey in search of myself. And it was just in one of those stops where I found a place that changed my life forever. It all started with a rusty old sign on a road in the middle of nowhere. If I hadn't been driving slower to enjoy the view of the fields, I would have totally missed it, but I saw it and decided to stop right next to that sign. I almost had to squint my eyes to see through the brown rust covering what was written, Adelaide 100 miles, with an arrow pointing to the left. I thought Adelaide must be one of those interesting little towns that you come across sometimes along the way, and then discover later that they are real hidden pearls. I had never heard of this place, and it didn't appear on the map either, so I was very excited to see something new. I kept going down a long, dusty road, always waiting for that left turn, until I finally came across a dirt road that branched off from the main road and into a dense forest. The undergrowth had grown so thick that I could barely see the pavement that had once been there. In fact, there were stretches where the road was completely covered in grass, which made me think that if I wasn't consciously looking for this place, I most likely would never have come across it. I would have missed it completely. I thought that perhaps the townspeople simply enjoyed their isolation and had no interest in anyone finding them, so they weren't concerned that the road was in such bad condition. I maneuvered my car along that grassy road and entered the forest, where the trees were huge and the shadows of the trees completely enveloped my car. Barely enough sunlight shone through the foliage, illuminating just enough so that I didn't hit a tree as I drove slowly over the dry leaves. After circling for over an hour, I finally reached the end of the road. There were moments when I thought I wouldn't make it because it was quite difficult to find my way through so much vegetation. I looked ahead and finally saw vestiges of civilization. Before me stretched a small village with one-story buildings and square shapes on both sides of its streets. At first glance, it looked like many other villages I had encountered on my journey. However, there was something strange here. The atmosphere was too quiet and gave the appearance of being empty. That is, normally, upon arriving in a new place, at least a few curious onlookers usually peek out to look at my beat-up car, or there are people walking the streets or children playing outside. But in this town, there was no one anywhere. They weren't even peeking out of the windows. At that moment, I knew I had stumbled upon either a place full of very reserved and surly people, or a town that was simply uninhabited. Still, I held out hope that it was just a quiet day and decided to approach a hotel that had a sign at the entrance. When I arrived, I noticed that my car was the only one in the empty parking lot. I opened the hotel door expecting to find someone at the front desk or thereabouts, but like the rest of the town, there was no one there either. The reception desk was deserted, and although I rang the bell, no one showed up. At that moment, I realized that the place must have been abandoned by its inhabitants, but I could not understand why. But there was something else that caught my attention, and that is that despite the fact that no one was there, the floor and the hotel counter were not dirty and full of dust, as is to be expected in a place where no one lives. Everything seemed to be intact, and it was strange, but that could be because the entrance was well closed and did not let the dust pass. I didn't think much of the car and decided to take a key that I found on the shelf behind the counter. I headed for the room that was marked on the key ring, although the idea of staying in an abandoned hotel didn't excite me at all, but I was very tired. It had taken me hours to get to this town, and all I wanted now was a decent bed. Besides, I had spent the last few nights sleeping in my car and my body was exhausted, so I opened the door to the room, which creaked a little, and upon seeing inside, my hopes of having a comfortable place to rest were completely dashed. I did not like what I saw at all. Although the room appeared to be relatively well kept, the condition of the sheets quickly changed my mind. There was some kind of red mold covering the bed, and the smell. God, it was horrible. Something like a mixture of rotten and forgotten. It was so overpowering that I gagged and slammed the door shut, determined to find another room because that one I definitely wouldn't be staying in. I went back to the front desk and got another key, but when I entered a new room I found the same problem. The red mold I had seen earlier was on the bed and on a chair, smelling just as repulsive. But I wouldn't give up, so I tried another room. But there it was again, the same mold again, covering everything. I was about to give up after looking at the 10th room, when suddenly something shiny caught my attention above the mold on the bed, something glistening in the sunlight filtering through the curtains. I approached the bed to see what it was and realized that it was a golden ring with glittering diamonds. Without thinking, my hand moved to pick it up. I no longer cared to touch the disgusting thing, but just as my finger brushed the mold, a sharp pain shot through my entire arm. I instantly let go of the ring and stepped back. Suddenly, I didn't want either the ring or to stay in that place, so I ran for my car and sped out of town. By the time I got to the woods, the pain was unbearable. So I stopped and reached for the first aid kit I always carried with me and poured some isopropyl alcohol over the area where I had touched the mold. As soon as the liquid touched my skin, a stabbing pain erupted in my finger, and upon closer inspection, I saw that it had formed a bloody blister like a very small balloon, but it hurt like hell. I touched the small bloody bubble gently and bang, it burst, splattering everywhere. At that moment, I started to feel a burning itch in every place where my blood splattered. Every time the blood touched my skin, it started to itch and burn. I immediately tried to wipe it off with a towel, but to my horror, the blood wouldn't go away. It had embedded itself into my skin, turning into red sores that looked too much like the mold I had seen at the hotel. It has now been 4 days since all that, and I find myself confined in a state hospital. I have been placed in a restricted area where there is only me. Doctors come in and out wearing white suits and covering them from head to toe in masks. They have done any number of tests, and I still don't have a diagnosis. Meanwhile, the sores have spread more and more, and I can feel them wearing away my skin, leaving me with arms that look like just skin and bones. Try as I might, I can't shake this horrible feeling that soon, any day now, what's left of me will fall apart too, as the itching is constant and the blood won't stop. Despite all the effort the doctors have made and the amount of medication they have given me, I have not improved one bit. Only the pain has been mitigated a bit by the painkillers. But whatever I have, it seems to keep progressing. Right now, I am almost certain that these are my last days. But what really torments me is that I may have inadvertently brought something with me that will end up condemning the rest of the world to this dreadful fate. It was early August when I was at my friend's house along with a couple of buddies enjoying a relaxing evening. We had a fire in his backyard and were having a few beers, something we often did. His dog, a 2-year-old golden retriever named Max, who interestingly had the same name as his owner, Max, joined us as we talked. Max, the dog, loved to play catch, so we would throw his frisbee to him in his huge yard for fun. Max's house had a large expanse of land that stretched about 70 yards to a forest between the houses across the street. We were having a great time with the dog, but at that he suddenly started barking like crazy in the direction of the house behind the woods, totally in his own world, completely ignoring us. He growled, barked, and seemed to see something we couldn't see, but after a few minutes he came back with his frisbee, as if nothing had happened, forgetting whatever it was that made him have this strange behavior. We didn't make a big deal out of Max's little outburst and just kept talking and hanging out. But it wasn't long when Max, the owner, stopped dead in the middle of what he was saying and stared off into the woods. We all turned, confused, but didn't notice anything unusual. Then Max commented that the house behind his was abandoned, and when I looked closer I noticed that there was a faint yellow light flickering in the second-floor window, which was definitely not on before. He explained to us that that house had suffered a fire and the family had moved out after that. Although we were a little scared, curiosity got the better of us, and since there were 4 of us, we decided to finish our beers and go explore the abandoned house. We weren't weak guys, so we felt pretty safe, but Max decided to bring his BB gun just in case. After that, we wandered into the woods and came to the backyard of the house. As we approached the back door, I noticed that there was a huge empty pool. The water looked green and thick, giving it a scary abandoned look. We tried to open the back door, but it was locked, so we decided to go to the front of the house to make sure there were no neighbors watching, and then tried the front door, which to our surprise was unlocked. Max went through first with his air gun in hand the whole time while we followed close behind. My first impression upon entering was unsettling, as many walls were blackened by fire and a couple of windows were broken. Perhaps by fire or by intruders, although technically we were intruders as well. The floor was littered with burned and crusty areas, so we had to be careful when walking around. There was no furniture in what appeared to be the living room, and the place was dimly lit by a light coming from what appeared to be the kitchen. And as I approached that room, I realized that the light source was a flashlight, but it was in the sink. That was weird, but what really disturbed me was that that window looked right into Max's backyard, which meant that whoever put that flashlight there could have seen us sitting around the fire. It gave me the feeling that maybe it was there on purpose, as if they knew we were in the abandoned house. It was at that point that Max got the bright idea to check the basement, and I have to admit that wasn't my first choice, especially after what we had seen. He opened the burned basement door and I pulled out my cell phone to shine the flashlight. Everything was completely scorched, and the stairs looked unusable. It didn't take an expert to intuit that the fire must have started down there. With relief, I closed the door and followed Max as we climbed the stairs, which oddly enough appeared to be intact. When we reached the second floor, I saw that everything was surprisingly fine, indicating that the fire had been put out in time. Then I began to realize that that dilapidated house had once been a good home for someone. There were 5 rooms upstairs, and the layout was similar to Max's house. It really must have been quite a nice, spacious place. As we entered one of the rooms, all was quiet until we were startled by a sound. There was music coming from another room. It wasn't loud, but it was definitely audible. We all heard Max storm out and followed in his wake as we tried to locate the source of the sound. It was coming from the last room on the left, but the door was locked. Max didn't hesitate and opened it, shouting, "Who's there?" while pointing his air gun. However, when we looked inside, we found only a Bluetooth speaker in the center of the room, something strange. But it clearly didn't come to that place alone. The only place left to check was the closet, so we started asking the person in there to come out. But of course, the door never moved, so we decided to open it ourselves. To our surprise, the closet was completely empty. This left us completely baffled. We had already checked the whole house and found no one. The tension of opening that door had already made us nervous, so we decided to run out of the house. As soon as we stepped into the backyard, we exchanged incredulous glances and started making our way to Max's house. As we walked away, I couldn't help but look back, seeing the dim light of the flashlight still shining in the kitchen through the window. That's when another friend turned and said, "Guys, someone is watching from the window." My jaw dropped. On the second floor, right in the room where we had found the speaker, there was a silhouette staring at us. Max suggested we turn back, but neither of us was willing to risk it. So we continued through the woods toward his house, feeling a strange pressure as if someone was following us. It was as if this person knew exactly what we were doing and had been watching us the whole time, even when we arrived. I didn't understand why he had hidden. Maybe he just wanted to scare us, or maybe he didn't think there would be 4 of us. Our only theory was that the person had gone into the attic when he saw us approaching, since we had only seen the rest of the place. But again, that was just a guess. I'm not sure how things would have gone if there had only been 2 of us. But honestly, I'd rather not find out. My father grew up in an old coastal town where legends and superstitions are things that are taken very seriously. Near his house, there was an abandoned property that aroused the fear and curiosity of all the locals in equal measure. This was a huge house with great architectural beauty, whose foundation dated back to colonial times and originally belonged to a wealthy Spanish landowner, but in the early 20th century was bought by an Afro-descendant landowner named Ernesto Anserni. Even my father said that many neighbors were convinced that they had a kind of satanic pact that had been passed down from generation to generation, and this was the reason why they became a very wealthy family. Perhaps one might think that these statements were just conjectures and hearsay of envious and malicious people with nothing better to do. But in reality, there was a good reason for the townspeople to think this way. and that is, that in that huge house that was protected behind high concrete walls, very strange and chilling events began to occur that over the years gave rise to all kinds of speculations. It all began in 1920, when one morning, for no apparent reason, Ernesto Anserni locked himself in one of the rooms of the house and set fire to himself, thus ending his life. This event shocked everyone in the village, not only because it was the first time that something so horrible happened in that place, but also because, according to the story, a few days before that terrible event, Anserni was seen in the company of a huge black dog that no one had ever seen before. It was said that the animal appeared out of nowhere and never left the man's side at any time. This was too strange, because the neighbors claimed that in all the years that Anserni had lived in that place, he never had a pet. In fact, the closest people assured that he never liked animals, and what was even more suspicious, after his death, they never saw that creepy animal again. After the tragedy, Ernesto Anserni's wife decided to move to another place with their 3 younger children, while their eldest son stayed living in the property until 1940, when he also died in strange circumstances in the same house, when he was the same age as his father, 40 years old. This second tragic event only strengthened the rumors that the house was cursed, as was the Anserni family. After this event, the house remained uninhabited for a couple of years, until in 1945, Diego Anserni, the youngest son of the family, returned from Spain after getting married and decided to move into the old house with his wife, but not before doing some renovations. However, it was from here that things took a very sinister turn. Diego's wife was young and very beautiful, tall, slender, with beautiful blonde hair and a very charismatic personality. Her name was Alicia, and it is said that from the moment she arrived in town, she began to arouse the interest of many men. The girl received many compliments wherever she went, and some men did not even care that she was married to try to court her, sometimes even in front of her husband. This was something that infuriated Anserni, who on more than one occasion reacted violently not only against those men who dared to flirt with his wife, but also against herself. It is said that he became increasingly jealous and controlling with Alicia, to the point of not letting her go out alone anywhere. According to the locals, the arguments between the couple became more and more frequent, and it was all due to Diego's unhealthy jealousy. However, just a couple of years after moving into the house, a new tragic event shook the town, and once again, it was related to the Anserni family. One morning, the town awoke to the news that young Alicia de Anserni, only 22 years old, had taken her own life. Her husband had allegedly found her hanging from a rope in her bedroom. This caused an enormous commotion in the place, first because due to her kind character and her great personality, the young woman had won the affection of all her neighbors. And second, because no one believed that she had attempted against her own life, everyone suspected that it had been Diego for his unhealthy jealousy who had hurt his young wife. Although the prefect of the town took the husband's version as true, the people never believed it, because it was well known that he had connections with the wealthy family, and that he owed many favors to the Anserni. However, it was the chilling events that began to occur since then in that huge house, which ended up strengthening in the town the belief that Diego Anserni had indeed murdered his wife and that the house was really cursed. Since that tragic event in 1945, very strange and chilling things began to happen in the Anserni house. Contrary to what many expected, Diego continued to live on the property for a few more years, but spent most of his time at the family estate. The man also had a large wall erected around the building, but even so, it was inevitable that the neighbors would notice the strange noises and unexplainable events that occurred there. Regardless of the time of day or whether the owner was there or not, in the house you could hear banging on the walls, lights turning on and off by themselves, objects falling to the floor, and what was more terrifying, at night when everything was silent, you could hear a woman crying in the distance and sometimes screams, and even laughter. Everyone in town was sure that it was Alicia's spirit wandering around that house looking for justice, since the closest neighbors believed that all these supernatural events, the noises, the flickering lights, the objects hitting the walls and the woman's crying, came precisely from the room where Alicia's lifeless body was said to have been found. A few years later, Diego Anserni met another young woman, daughter of a well-known landowner in the area, married her, and moved to a nearby town, leaving the house completely uninhabited. But the villagers say that every week he returned, according to them, with bags full of candles, flowers, and offerings to try to appease the angry spirit of his deceased wife. But that was of little use, since those supernatural events continued to occur. As time went by, the neighbors became accustomed to these events, and the house became a sort of icon of the town. However, it would be 40 years before an extraordinary event finally brought to light the whole truth about what really happened to Alice of Anserny, but no one was prepared for that chilling revelation. In 1986, when my father was 11 years old, the legend of the cursed house was already well known in the village and beyond. As over the decades the legend spread, and many curious people came from far and wide to see the property and see if the legend was true. Throughout the decades, several people tried to buy the property, but Diego Anserny never accepted any offer. There were also many curious people who tried to enter the house, but this was almost impossible, since there was no way to jump over those huge walls, which were also protected with spikes on top. However, in 1985 there was a big alluvium in the area, so many properties were lost and others were seriously damaged. Until then, nobody had noticed, but apparently in this natural disaster a big rock hit the back of the wall that protects the house, which was completely covered with weeds, and the impact opened a big hole in that part. One afternoon, my father was playing soccer with other children from the village when one of them kicked the ball so hard that it went behind the cursed house. Seeing the direction the ball had taken, the boys looked at each other and decided to make a challenge to draw lots to see who would go into the area to look for it. And as you can imagine, my dad was among the winners. So together with 4 other lucky ones, he made his way through the bush to get to where they thought the ball had fallen. And while they were looking for it, they found the hole in the concrete wall. When they saw this, they were very frightened and immediately ran off to tell their companions what they had found. After deliberating for a while, the children decided to enter and explore the old cursed house of the Anserny, but not before making a wooden cross and reviewing Psalm 91 in case things got ugly. My father told me that upon entering everything was overgrown with weeds, but they managed to make it all the way to the entrance of the house. However, they couldn't do anything because the door was padlocked, as was the back door and a side door leading to a large porch. After exploring the surroundings looking for some point through which they could access the interior of the huge house, they found a window that did not have a protective grille. The frame was wide enough for a person to enter, so they broke the glass and entered through there. My dad told me that upon entering the house, everything was completely covered in dust and spider webs, and certainly this house was everything you would expect from a haunted house. After exploring various parts of the place, including the upper rooms, they noticed that there was a hallway that led only to a very heavy-looking iron door that was locked from the outside with a huge padlock. Obviously, they went over there and started to move it to see if they could open it, but when they did, they heard some terrible screams from the other side of the door. Immediately, my father and the other children started running in complete terror, and as they did so, the screams went on and on. The boys rushed out of the house and quickly went to tell the rest of the neighbors that they had encountered the ghost of the cursed house. Upon hearing the story of the children, a group of neighbors entered the place and arrived at the door they had pointed out. And indeed, they also heard the screams, but while the most superstitious spoke of looking for a priest and holy water for an exorcism, for the skeptics that had a much more earthly explanation. So they set out to break down the door, and when they did so, they could not believe their eyes. There, dressed only in an old worn-out robe, with her hair down to her ankles and completely white, her nails almost as long as her hair, severely malnourished and curled up in a ball on an old and dirty bed, was Alicia de Anserny, the woman they all thought had been dead for 40 years. It turns out that Alicia, the once young and beautiful wife of Diego Anserny, never took her own life, but rather that this ruthless and very sick man kept her captive in a room of that huge house for more than 40 years, while he made everyone believe that she had taken her own life. The saddest part of all this is that those banging, wailing, flashing lights and all the signs that people saw and heard for 4 decades in that house and that they assumed were ghostly manifestations were actually Alicia's desperate attempts to find help to escape from that horrible prison, but no one came to her calls. The reason her husband returned to the old house every week was not to appease any spirits, but to bring Alicia food and water to simply keep her alive in that hell. By the time she was rescued, Alicia was 63 years old and her physical and mental condition was so deteriorated that she could never fully recover. Upon examination, doctors found old slash marks on her wrists, suggesting that at some point she had made an attempt on her own life. After the discovery, the authorities reported the truth to her relatives in Spain, who were just as dismayed as everyone else in the village, as they too were told that Alicia had not been among the living since 1945. Fortunately, they took her back to her native country to take care of her, and there she spent the last years of her life with her loved ones, until she finally departed this world at the age of 85. As for Diego Ancerni, he was imprisoned and sentenced to 40 years in prison for his crimes, but only 2 years after his arrest, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and after suffering from this disease for 3 more years, he finally lost the battle and passed away at the age of 68. My father told me that after this terrible event came to light, Diego's children decided to demolish the house and donated the land to a non-profit foundation to build a children's hospital, probably with the intention of clearing the family name a bit and in a way to erase from the town anything that might remind them of this macabre and shameful episode in their history.